So the new Guild Wars 2 expansion brought us the new weapon mastery system, which essentially provided us with every elite spec weapon in other elite specs. For example, let's say that you could only use greatsword on Reaper in Necromancer, but now you can use the greatsword on other things like Harbinger, like Scourge, and even on Core Necromancer, which is very, very cool. It gives you a lot of more builds to use, more things to, more combinations of things to have, of course. But it also brings some negatives. For example, if a weapon is very, very strong, and now you can apply it to every one of your specs, that's probably gonna be the weapon you're gonna use on every spec, which definitely sucks. So let's talk about the positives, negatives about this new system, and whether it was indeed a mistake. Let's talk about the positives first. First, of course, this allows us to get more builds together. Before, you couldn't have a greatsword Harbinger. Now you can. Now you can try out and do a power version of or Harbinger that used to be only Conti. Now, is it that good? Well, probably Harbinger is not really doing that. Power Harbinger is probably not that good right now, but it does give you more possibilities, which is kind of nice. You can try new things, even if they're bad. You can, at least try it out and see if it is or not, right? Before you couldn't, right? So the amount of possibilities in the game are bigger. There's more complexity, I guess, to it, and I think that's a very, very good positive to have, right? For sure. The other positive is actually weapon mechanics. Some of the weapon mechanics, like for example, Weavers, are kind of stuck in one weapon most of the time, right? Like in a few weapons, right? For example, the weaving between two elements, it's only stuck to sword and all the core versions of the weapons from LE, right? But now that you can actually move it out, you can actually use hammer there. There are certain abilities that are essentially gonna become different because of the fact that you can use this with this other weapon, right? You can do the same thing with Untamed Hammer. Now the hammer, the unleash abilities, you can actually use them on Soul Beast and actually have a little bit of Untamed in Soul Beast, which is, I think it's pretty fun and makes it a bit more, I think it's kind of cool that, the Untamed mechanics almost like merge with the Soul Beast mechanics, and you have like this little hybrid because the weapon is so it's so entangled with the professional mechanic, right? The other thing I think is it gives more possibilities for RP builds, right? There's a lot of weapons. There's a lot of people who just would want to use different weapons in different specs because that's the identity they want for the build, right? Beforehand, you can really do, like for example, Harbinger. I find it's so funny to use Greatsword with Harbinger. It feels like you're this like monk warrior with a big sword, and it's just so it's a bit goofy, but it's also so badass, right? Like you're jumping around and you bring in your greatsword and you just fucking destroy everything. It's maybe not that powerful, of course, but you know what? It's pretty cool nonetheless. And I think having that possibility, having all of those weapons that are essentially were locked behind other specs, it definitely feels good. I think it feels good that you can have these wacky combinations of things. Now for the negatives, and this one will be as well, just coming out from this one, would be the fact that, the fact that they essentially, these weapons kind of leave their spec, it damages their identity a little bit, right? For example, Reaper used to be with the Greatsword, right? And now the Greatsword is somewhere else, and now it feels less Reaper-y to have the Greatsword. And I think that's kind of that kind of sucks, right? Of course, you can have one without the other, you can have the positive without the negative, but I think it's important to mention it. Also, I think in this more for balance, it gives you less knobs to play around. And why is that? You would expect the fact that you essentially free everything up for everyone to use and every weapon to use in every spec to essentially give you more possibilities to tune things down in different ways, in different situations. But actually, I think it does the opposite, because beforehand you could tune off the skill, you could tune the spec with the weapon. Right? Because then, let's say that Harbinger is not doing that good. Let's say that that's what's happening. Now you can just pump a pistol for it, and now the Harbinger is gonna be doing pretty good, right? And you don't actually have to deal with the trace of Harbinger at all, right? Which is, I think, very useful, right, for balance, especially when you kind of struggle with it, and it sometimes does, right? But now, because pistol is actually in everywhere, in Scourge as well, what do? Do you nerf pistol because Scourge uses it very well and essentially does an insane amount of damage? But then if you do that, then you're affecting Harbinger, and now Harbinger is going to get nerfed as well. So what do? Well, you're forced essentially to nerf Scourge instead, the traits of Scourge and the spec itself, which sometimes can fuck up other builds, right? So it's definitely it's almost like, it's almost not like a negative, but like it's like a consequence of this. But I think it's very, very important to mention that this complicates things in terms of like a balance for that reason, right? This also leads to the fact that, well, if one weapon is very, 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 very powerful, it'll be essentially used in every spec. For example, Greatsword on Revenant. Right now, Greatsword is very, 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 very good. It does a lot of damage, but now here's a problem. If you use it everywhere, you use it on Herald, you use it on Vindicator, and I guess I don't think Power Renegade is a thing anymore, but if it was, you would use Greatsword on it as well. And then, you know, you're not gonna see Sword ever in that build, in those builds. So if one of the weapons does everything and it's too powerful, it just dominates the whole class, which is honestly, in my opinion, a problem that should be fixed. And it's not an easy thing to do because, well, as we said before, if you nerf Greatsword, you know, you're gonna nerf Vindicator. And then Vindicator gets fucked and there's nothing to do with it. And you have to essentially buff that one. It's definitely a big problem to have. And honestly, the only way to fix it, in my opinion, is to have weapons reworked, which is honestly a lot of work. Every weapon essentially needs to do one thing that does well, and it has negatives. Because honestly, otherwise, you're kinda having this problem where if it does everything, it just dominates the whole class. And there's a lot of weapons that do actually do too much, right? Especially because beforehand, because they were locked behind elite specs, Arena was like, well, might as well give them a lot so they can, you know, enjoy their new weapon from the elite spec, right? But now, because of that, well, you know, those weapons are very, very powerful, like Warhorn in Elemental, right? In Elementalist, right? It just does too much. It does boon duration, does a lot of damage, it does a lot of counter damage, it does a lot of power damage. It just boons as well, like CC pulls, it's everything, right? So you just have to rework it and you have to nerf it a lot and essentially change how it, like, nerf something that was honestly beforehand pretty powerful and pretty fun to play with, right? Now, does it have to be bad? It doesn't. You can essentially specialize weapons for them to be actually very, very, they do one thing very well and they have a very, very strong identity for what they do, and they can definitely do this, right? For example, in Revenant, I think it would be very nice if essentially Greatsword and Sword like are more or less the same amount of damage, but if you want to do the most amount of damage, you have to have both of them. But then if you want to have CC, because they don't give you any CC in both of them, you have to sacrifice one of them to get staff in, so that way it kind of balances out. But they're gonna have to essentially deal with that, right? They're gonna have to find a way to actually do this and rework them. Well, I guess Revenant is kind of easier because you just have to essentially nerf the damage. But in something like Warhorn in Elementalist, it's going to be a bit different. You're going to have to essentially make it probably a weapon that you don't use for damage, you use for utility, you know, for maybe boon duration and maybe some C, but doesn't do as much damage. So it's like this option, like this utility option on Ellie, instead of being this jack of all trades that does everything and very, very well, right? Now, I think overall negatives ends up summarizing as, well, this weapon mastery makes the game harder to balance. It does. It gives you more possibilities, more design space, but it gives you a bigger problem. And do I think Ennet can do this? I think they can. I think it's definitely a thing that they can deal with, but they're gonna have to. And will they? We're gonna have to see, you know, on Tuesday when they actually release the new patch notes, right? And we're gonna see how they are handling these issues, right? I'm hopeful, but we'll see what happens. I'm not gonna, you know, pretend like I know that 100% they're gonna find a way to do it. They definitely can, and I definitely think they are intelligent enough to do it. But we'll see if they'll make it work. Overall, I think the weapon mastery feature is overall a positive, but it is only a positive if they can deal with the consequences it brings. So we'll see if that's the case. Otherwise, overall, it'll be a negative thing for the game. We'll see how it works. We'll see what happens. Tell me what you think. Tell me if I'm wrong. Let's talk about it. Subscribe to the channel. Follow my Twitch. See you guys around. Love you all. Bye-bye.